So, a lot of information. Anybody have any questions? Yes?
My one main concern with pulling out invasive species manually and doing it physically is making sure that all that material ends up bagged and not spread, because knotweed will spread out of 1 inch, but so will ivy. And I know Josh and I have spent time talking to each other about this. I have a tendency to not want to use sprays. I have a lot of allergies and I'm very chemical sensitive. In fact, this room is bothering me a little bit because so many people have so much scent on. But I really am concerned when you remove manually how easy it is to spread things. And I really am concerned that not using spray on knotweed in particular, I have sided with Josh, and he has convinced me that using herbicides in a very controlled environment and very carefully what he uses is better than doing it manually. And it took a lot of years for us to come to that agreement.
Thank you. Did you have a question, Betty?
Yeah, I'm wondering why no mention was made of biologicals, because they're really extending greatly. For those that don't know, these are bugs and beetles and sorts of things that interfere with the reproductive cycle in some way. And not one mention was made of that.
I'm really at fault for that. Actually, the state of Oregon has the most renowned weed biological control program in the world, for the reason that they have the highest rate of success. Historically, what's happened is you go to the place where this plant came from, Japanese knotweed, somewhere in Asia, one imagines, and you locate the bug that's eating it down to the ground in that part of the world, and you import it. And in the past, that was a kind of shotgun approach, and those bugs ended up eating everything else as well as the, So, that's become a challenge. But Oregon is very successful. I think, purple loosestrife and a group of other plants have been very, very successfully managed that way. Most of the plants you're talking about as invasive threats in the Yachats community at the moment don't have major herbivores that are important predators or that consume them. It doesn't mean it won't happen. I should have referred to it, I'm sorry about that. But in my preparation, it hadn't seemed like that was a particularly good option. There are some plants that if they occur in your community, then importing some of those bugs or going to sites where biological control is successful to bring some of those insects in, that can work really well. And through our centre, we'd be very glad to support that kind of activity. We work very closely with the state, and it's when it works, it's fantastic. Because normally insects, they'll eat the plants almost down to the ground. But as the food supply gets shorter, the insects kind of somewhat disappear and they get less dense, and the plants escape a little bit again, and then the insects come back and eat them. And so 10 years later on, there's this little patch that's left that's not causing anybody a problem, but the insects and plants have reached some kind of equilibrium. So when it works well, it's great. Just unfortunately, for many of the plants that are on that nice leaflet, they don't have major biological control efforts for them at the moment. And there's another feature that this is a coastal area, the climate's different. Not all the bugs that do well in eastern Oregon and in the Great Basin are going to do well here. And also there's a factor of scale, that insect biological control agents don't tend to do terribly well when they've got one little patch to go to, because where do they go when all that front's gone? If there was something like Japanese knotweed, Josh would be, he'd start a business and he'd be driving around in a Cadillac.
ODA came out last year with some information that the biological was being tested in England.
That may well be true.
It's been released.
Huh?
It's actually, I believe, been released in controlled sites in England.
Yeah.
or that was the idea in 2010.
Yeah.
I believe it's the same bug that they're studying at OSU right now. I think I had an email correspondence from Fritzy, who was spearheading that, and I think that might be in home right now.
There are 21 candidate plants for which there are biological controls being investigated in Oregon at present. So if you wanted some time, one of us could come back and we can invite an expert and you can hear about that. It's just, one can raise hope slightly falsely sometimes, because when it works it's fantastic, but there's more plants to deal with. But thank you so much for mentioning that. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, I clear land for sites, for homes and things like that, and then I just wonder if there's any tips. I might have a whole acre of blackberry or a whole acre of scotch broom, and I bring it down to dirt. And I usually tell my customers, plant grass and mow it, and then things get discouraged. Is there anything else in my soil preparation, any tips that you guys have that I could pass on to my customers? Starting with a clean slate.
Well,
You really want to kill everything,
like Paul said,
start over.
seed bank is a rough beast to deal with, especially when it comes along with seed banks like Scotch broom. Outside of completely removing the topsoil, if you had an infestation like that, it's going to be tough. Really good competitive grass could probably go a long ways, but it's a tough situation. Does anybody on the panel have a?
It's a good biological for blackberry goats.
Well, but if your question was native soil that's being cleared for development, right? Not soil that's already infected with invasives.
No, mine actually was. I deal with a lot of Scotch broom blackberry.
Okay,
And
so it's
if
already
it's inside, I
disturbed.
can mow it, and I can dig it up, and I can burn it, crap it, but there's a gazillion roots left.
Right.
And then so, what I've done on the land that we have ourselves is wait till little blackberries come up and go around spot spray when they're little. And that seems to be a little better than spraying masses of plants, but I guess there's no good preparation when you're just looking at dirt. I've got done, I've scraped all the dirt up, cleaned all the vegetation off. There's nothing to be done there between, Mother Nature and the homeowner, is there really?
Well, yeah, just encouraging people to think about their land as not something that's just going to be left alone, that they're going to need to manage it in some way.
Yeah.
And when people have something they care about, a lawn area, shrubs that they want to grow, and one thing that happens in Corvallis is our Benton County Soil and Water Conservation District runs a native plant sale every year. It's just become this incredibly popular thing where you can get very low-cost plants, and these slips, the 18-inch long stakes that you can plant in the fall, you may have to plant them when they're the right way up. You just kind of put them into the ground and make sure the soil closes around them. You don't really need to mulch or do very much, and they just do fantastically well. So I wonder whether this is one thing the group might consider with the Soil and Water Conservation District, would be talking about a kind of native plant sale where particular selections could be brought that you might advise your the customers, the people you're working with, to go along and consider native plants that kind of evolved here that are going to thrive in those areas. And it may be someone says, well, I want a low maintenance yard, but we were talking today about some wonderful plants that would grow in this habitat, like ninebark is what we talked about, this wonderful profuse flowering shrub. And there's a variety of things like berries that don't do so well on the coast, but salmonberry, twinberry, the flowering currants, and if you have a mixed hedgerow of those, they're going to be there a century from now, and they may not support that invasive community so much. And then some people nowadays want to raise a garden and have cultivated flower borders and vegetables and things like that. So if you're constantly cultivating, then you're taking care of those plants in the hot spots. So these are all, none of these are a total solution to what you're talking about. It is a challenge, but I think working with the district on this idea of increasing knowledge about the native plants that can support bees and beneficial insects, and there are native plant nurseries now that will happily come out to a group of homeowners and with a load of plants in the back of a truck and say, look, this is flowering now, this is what it looks like when it's grown up. And here's a deal, if you all want to buy like 250 plants as a group together, we'll give you a 15% cut on the price. So there are some options. So I think it's wonderful that you came. And I think what you're presenting the group with is kind of an opportunity to work with the people you work with to do something creative. Knowing that you've already done something pretty important, which is to remove those plants in the first place. And then good management afterwards is this kind of, it's more of an art than a science really, you know, being creative and managing those habitats. And, you know, we were talking today, we've got an absolute consensus, haven't we, that putting in native plants that's kind of outcompetes these is the long-term solution for having a beautiful place with plants that were there before kind of humans came along. So that's a kind of an idea. So my suggestion is stay in touch with this group, and I'm going to send Wally and Josh and others some information when I go back to Corvallis, a long, long way, it's a big city. And there's a place in Corvallis called the Natural Resources Conservation Service Plant Materials Centre, and believe it or not, and what these guys do, and gals, they go all around Oregon in our ecological region. They find patches of native plants, and they test whether or not they're genetically different from the same species of native plants in other places. And if they are, they produce large plantings of these different species and different subspecies and types of these wonderful plants. So, believe it or not, there's a place near Corvallis where you can through your group and through the Soil and Water Conservation District, they can find out just which plants are do best here. Probably come up with a kind of 50 plant list with who stocks them and what the costs are. And one approach might be just to make people more aware of the options for those plants and have a plant sale perhaps every winter or spring. Like my wife and I go to these sales, and we've planted, well, I should say that Sue's planted them actually, but put in a lot of these lovely plants in our own yard. So that's my kind of thought.
I'll just put in a quick plug. The Soil and Water District actually began doing their native plant sale in Lincoln out of Newport for the first time in a long time this year. We had a lot of great native plants like the ones he just mentioned. A lot of them were sourced, I believe sourced seed from the coast, grown out in the valley. A lot of the planting projects we do, because we do a lot of different work, not just weed work, we typically get seed that's sourced from the coast and more adapted to these conditions for replanting out in the riparian areas. But maybe it's time to beef it up a little bit. Get more plants.
Yes.
Oh, it's not a question, but just to add to the plants that you can use is there's Thompson's Nursery, just 3 miles out of Walport. It has this fantastic sale every spring, and you can tell anybody that's moving here that they can spend $100 and get a lot of rhododendrons, and they do wonderfully here. And you know, the only thing is you plant them and stand back.
I can add something to that. I believe, Josh, next week is the Woodlands plant sale. Is it next weekend? It's coming up real shortly. Those are native trees. The Master Gardener sale in May last year had over 400 native plants for sale. These are shrubs, trees, herbaceous plants, and they will have likewise this year.
Yeah. So we can't underestimate the value of doing this. I mean, you each plant, each go and buy 5 plants. You know, how many people are here? Over 50. You know, that's whatever it is. You know, 250 plants. So you know, think of all the bees that are going to benefit from that, and think of all the plants that aren't going to invade the places you put those sticks. So they do really well.
Yes, Tom.
I'm Tom Carnes, and I just want to correct this statement that the reason Soil and Water, I think, stopped their spray last year was not because of concerned citizens for clean air. I want to get them off the hook. It was because of me. So if there's someone to point your disapprobation at, it's going to be me. And the reason was because the house that I was living in last fall was surrounded. Many of the sites that were planned to be sprayed or injected were within a few blocks of my house in every single direction. And I've had 2 strokes in the last 2.5 years, and both of them were related to herbicide applications, exposure to herbicides near my home. So I have an insistent letter from my treating physician that says you must avoid exposure to herbicide residues. So I did two things last fall. I asked this Lincoln County Public Health Committee to write a letter for me to support my request that soil and water not spray near my home. Because I don't know if you know anybody who's had strokes, but it can kill people. So, and the other thing I did was I contacted a lawyer and asked him to write a letter for me to support my request that they're not spraying near my home. So when Soil and Water chose to not spray last year, it was because of me and my health concern, my need. You know, if a physician tells you to avoid salt, you probably ought to avoid salt. If you don't, it's kind of your fault if you have a problem. My physician told me avoid exposures to herbicide, and I kind of have to protect myself. Other people have other health issues, but last year it was all my fault. So I just want to put a word out to support concerned citizens for clean air and take the onus off them that is on me.
Yeah, like Tom mentioned, there are other people in this community that are hypersensitive to chemicals. One thing we were doing at the district was providing as much open disclosure as we could about it, especially with the spraying we did along the river. I was happy to provide emails, calls, literally hours before we were going to do it, the day before. Do everything I could to try and address this so that if people wanted to leave town, I know that's not the best option, but if people wanted to leave town, they could. Because I believe that for most people, any exposure is going to happen during application and much less following after. It's, you know, there's a whole spectrum of sensitivities out there. Or we, you know, I was relieved when we weren't going to spray in town anymore, and I'm relieved that we're not anymore. I think urban sources of knotweed can be dealt with, especially with where the stage of it's at right now in this town, can be dealt with other weeds, other sides, especially to address people's concerns with that.
Oh, thank you for that. And, you know, it's really great that everyone's kind of so open and, you know, there's so much discussion, even for people that don't apparently always agree with each other, you know, that's a great signal about the health of this community. And I think it's also, I'm sure, going to be reflected in the number of people that sign up on the I just wanted to mention I just wanted to mention a little thing about like a chemical use strategy, because some of the communities up and down the coast in Washington State and other states have developed together a kind of a strategy or an approach. And here's one that I read. I just was worrying about this talk this morning, so I wrote down roughly what one community had done. You may come up with something completely different, but one, they said, first of all, herbicides would only ever be used as a last resort and only in combination with other practices like mowing, burning, or hand removal. It would only be after interagency cooperation and public education to determine this was, you know, that this was the right thing to do, people who properly consulted. They had a subset of herbicides which they're deemed to be lower risk than others and the only chemicals they find acceptable in their community. They had a 5-year reduction plan. At the end of 5 years, they wanted either herbicides to be used rarely, if ever again, but recognised they needed to be used early on. They would only accept spot and cut stump treatment. So in other words, you remove the adult plants, and then for regrowth and things like that, they may do treatments that are very, very localised, no area sprays. I'm not saying this is always a good thing, by the way, in terms of management practices, but this is an example. Only in the dry season in low wind. And so there was a couple of other things. I just wanted to pick on that. Just because it's dry doesn't mean that's the best time to spray necessarily. Because when the air is very dry, the pesticide droplets evaporate very quickly, they become buoyant in the air, they move around, you end up inhaling more than you would have done in cooler conditions. And the low wind thing is a fallacy as well. When it's really still and not very windy, that's again when the spray tends to move around and move down the watershed. So the time to spray is when the wind's blowing about 3 miles an hour, which isn't very often here. And I had a slide. I actually had a slide. Can I just end with this because it's quite fun? Something on our website, just to advertise the IPPC. I just love looking at your weather, by the way. What a lovely place to live. First of all, I wanted to pay tribute to the website. This is your group's put this together, have they?
That's, well,
Yachats, not
great work for the website.
Yeah, well, there's a really nice information on here, so well done whoever did that. And you can all find that. That's your very own website. So, I mean, this is a bit crazy, but on the IPPC's website, this is what farmers use in Oregon. They can find instantly, by just logging onto our website, it finds the weather station that's nearest to the computer that you're using. And I can tell you how to do this if you're interested. But here for this station, can you see the Yachats River here, and there's that weather station. This is the temperature for the whole of last year. It's almost constant.
Couple little lows.
I know, but most of the time it's almost warm enough, I noticed. That's really good. So this line here is the line where it's too hot to spray, where the spray basically evaporates so quickly there's no point doing it. This is an education program for farmers in Oregon. It's a major challenge of ours. We work with them all the time. Farmers do use chemicals, some of them at least. And so that line up there, if you can see it, you'll need binoculars to see it, to be on this lady here probably. Then this line here is relative. This line here is relative humidity, okay? In Pendleton, it's down around 20% most of the year. In Yachats, see, the average is about 90% relative humidity.
That's why
That means those little spray droplets are not evaporating so quickly that you're going to inhale them so much. It doesn't mean there won't be driftable droplets. It doesn't mean there's not vapor there. But in terms of in general for spray conditions, that's better than if you're out there in eastern Oregon. But look, here's your wind. This is the wind. So I understand Tom's concern because, you know, the wind's blowing from this direction. No, it's not. It's blowing from that direction. Wait a minute. And so what you find is, and there's other lines in here, that actually a rather small proportion of the time is it actually reasonable to spray according to many agricultural labels and the advice we give to farmers. A very small proportion of the time. So if you are interested, there's another part of your rule could be developed and get very, very high tech and actually use the forecasting systems we've got on here to determine when in the 5 days ahead using forecasts, if a spray was to be applied at all, ever, then you could determine if it's going to be reasonable conditions. I'm about to pull your television off. But then this shows the March 2010 basically. It shows for last year, for the whole of March. And you can play with this website, you can see 30-year averages, you can see the present day. But look at this wind in March. You have all of these high wind days when it's really unreasonable to expect a spray to go where you're spraying it, to be honest, unless you're right low to the ground. There's a narrow window here at times when it's okay, and a rather lot of the time, actually, you've got days when the air is too still to apply for the chemical to actually reside where you sprayed it. So we're really sensitive to the things you're telling us, and it is important to note that even if you're an advocate for this, you've got to be very, very careful not to share the chemical that's being applied. But there are tools out there that are going to allow you to be judicious and careful, and we're perfecting those at OSU. And so, you know, there are opportunities to use the services we offer, and we could work with your committee and do a little bit more. But yeah, I just wanted to add that to the end.
What website is that?
We, at the time of the spring, proposed spring, which did not happen, we had a neighbor that is highly sensitive and had made arrangements to go to the valley to spend a week away from Yachats. Would a week away for a highly sensitive person have escaped the dangers of the spring?
To be honest, you know, with all of these things, you've got to look at the specific circumstances. I mean, if someone's actually embedded where the chemicals are going to be applied. To be honest, most applicators are going to have quite a big buffer zone. They're not going to treat right up to someone's property line. If they did, then it's conceivable that there could be some residues that could be inhaled a week after treatment. Not very much, but it's conceivable. More likely, walking past the vegetation, brushing up to it, getting skin exposure, there might be some risk. It doesn't mean there's no residue around. But I mean, being away for a week would be an approach for a highly sensitive person to avoid it. And also, you can look at what direction the wind's blowing. If you're in a place where directly downwind of a place that's been sprayed, you're more likely to be a receipt of some residues than if you're not. There are analyses of house dust that take place, and what is sprayed outside your home does end up inside. There's no doubt about that. But it's high. There's so many different types of herbicides. To generalise about this, we just cannot do. And what many communities have done is to find the chemicals that are least volatile, least likely to be mobile in water, but have labels that allow them to be used in the type of situation that Josh described. And so you really have to look at case by case. I'm sorry. Could I just mention NPIC, National Pesticide Information Center? It's based at Oregon State. It's a 1-800 number. They're open 17 hours a day on the OSU campus. They speak, they have access to translation to almost any world language, but they're bilingual English and Spanish in the main. And you can ask questions like that. You can name the herbicide, and they will give you a quantitative, as best they can, answer if you're very sensitive. And that's what they're there to do. And so that's my advice would be to ask. And also, as a community, to set some kind of buffer zone, which is commonly done, that is acceptable, that would avoid anyone having even the concern they might be exposed.
I just wanted to add to that sometimes we're only talking about the active ingredient, which is on the label, but sometimes the active ingredient may only be 2% of the entire product, and it's inerts, adjuvants, sometimes petroleum distillates, which may be even more persistent or more harmful. The problem is we don't know what those are because the companies are not required to list them. So sometimes it makes that herbicide so effective may not be something we can identify. That was number one, and number two is just to reemphasize what Paul mentioned about sometimes we track things from outdoors to indoors, and then they're not degrading because of wind or sun or water, they're just there. So you have to remember, take your shoes off before you go in your homes. And this is all kinds of pollution, not just pesticide. Even what comes out of the car's tailpipe gets put on the sidewalks, the asphalt, and you track those wherever you go. So.
We are out of time, and I know a few of you still have questions. I do believe that our panelists are willing to stay around a little longer for the additional questions. But I do want to certainly thank the Academy and the Yachats Invasive Plant Subcommittee. Also, kudos to Greg Scott, who did the website for the invasive plants. We do have our sign-up sheet that is not required that you show up. It just lets us know to advise you when we are going to have our work events, and we'll send you an email. And remember that the next Academy event is March 17th, To Kill a Mockingbird. And thank you so much, panelists. This was